Hello, team, and welcome to another ATP Geopolitics video with myself, Jonathan MSP. This is Ukraine War Frontline update, rather belated one for the 12th of August, 2023. I released this previously and it had no sound. I'm so unbelievably frustrated. However, my body's a bit broken from swimming and being on a water slide today, and with my multiple sclerosis, goodness me, I'm not able to walk very well at the moment, so I thought I'd just chill in the room and do this frontline update. My partner is listening to her audiobook and chilling herself. So here goes. If you want to check out the map legend, here it is. That will let you know what all the lines on my map mean. For those who haven't seen my maps before, remember all the lines are Russian defensive lines. We'll go to the northeast sector, which is Kupiansk to Svatova, down to Crimea, down there. A bit of a mixed bag of nuts all along the eastern front, really. Eastern front sounds a bit weird, that a bit Second World Warish. The Russians have made some gains, as according to Syriac maps, pro-Russian mapper around the Sinkivka area. They appear to be getting closer to Sinkivka. There was rumours about fighting around there the other day. I don't think they were true, but the Russians are having most success in this area. There isn't too much resistance from the Ukrainians. The Russians have some force quantity advantages here in terms of both mechanized equipment and troops as well, and they are making some gains in some of these areas. We'll see how that develops. This Kupiansk area and the Crimea area, or towards Liman, were what. That's just further to the south here. What Hanna Maliar, the deputy defense minister, said were nightmare areas. However, although the Russians have made some gains according to Syriac maps further to the north of Kuzumivka around Kotlyarivka, haven't heard too much about Karmazianivka area and Kuzumivka area today. There are some gains for the Ukrainians, oddly enough, around the salient that's going towards Yampilivka. There is a little triangle of land that Andrew Perpetua says that the Russians have lost control of. There were some lost Russian pieces of equipment in that area. And then the Ukrainians were getting shelled by the Russians here. And in order for them to be shelled by the Russians can't be in control of that land. So he's adapted the mapping in that regard. But yeah, so good to see Ukrainians pushing back there as from a pro-Ukrainian point of view, given that this is an area where the Russians have had some success. A lot of heavy fighting in the Serebryensky forest, including the use of cluster munitions. If we go to Radio Hosu. In fact, if we go to Poulet Vallon here, there's the relies a lot on, to be honest, Andrew Perpetua's mapping, which I do as well. So there'll be very little difference, I guess, between his and my mapping. Although you can see the grey zone between the lines. I only use a defensive line. That's that triangle of area I was talking about. The Ukrainian gains all along this area in terms of taking control over the grey zone. So useful for them there, although the Russians are pushing south of Dobrova and pushing towards Torsk as well in that salient area. Radio Hosu, the Romanian analyst, says Kupiansk axis on the northern front, the Russians advanced towards Kupiansk 2 days ago. As of yesterday, Ukrainians without reserves started a counter-offensive operation and pushed the Russians a few hundred meters north towards Liman Pershi. I talked about that yesterday, about how there is this area just to the west of Liman Pershi, which is just here, where the Russians were pushed back and the Ukrainians took some land. And he continues push the Russians a few hundred meters north towards Liman Pershi. Svatova sector, the center of the front, the Ukrainians pushed them right back about 5 kilometers in the last 8 days. And Crimea, Liman, southern front, the Russians have not advanced at all towards Torsk for several days. And in the woods southwest of Crimea, the use of cluster bombs is driving the Russians back. So that's a very positive outlook for the Ukrainians along this front. I wouldn't say it's as positive maybe as that. They are under some pressure in that northeastern sector, but good to see them pushing back in certain areas too. Then we come to Bakhmut. Really not a lot to say about the Seversk front. We saw some activity in Spirna area where the Russians just north of there have been making some gains. In the north, we did hear about Rozdalivka, Russians making some gains there too. Not heard about anything about that area today. Around the M03, the E40 highway coming into the south to the north of Bakhmut. The Ukrainians were pushed back a little bit in this forest area by the highway. Uh, and they've also been pushed back in Bakivka. I think in Bakivka, they've probably cut their losses. Sunk cost fallacy not evident here, which is good. So they're not going to beat their head against a brick wall. It's quite tough on them there. So they pulled back from there in hope of finding weaknesses elsewhere. There are three kind of areas around here. So the Zalizhnyansky along the highway, the Dubovo-Vasilivka area, and the Bakivka area here. If the Russians were to lose in any of these places, it kind of undermines the whole area. So if they lose in Bakivka, the Ukrainians will be able to push across and interdict the highway and then cut off these forces. If they push in Dubovo-Vasilivka, they cut these forces in two and interdict the highway as well. And if the Ukrainians push in Zalizhnyansky, they can come in behind, interdict the highway from the north, and come in behind or join up with troops in Bakivka area. So all of these areas are holding quite well for the Russians at the moment, and they need that to be the case. Anyway, as we come further to the south, there's talk about activity around Klishchiivka. This is what Syriac Map says, and I'm, to be fair, a little bit dubious about this. I think this is maybe activity that took place previously or activity that didn't take place. So Syriac Map says that following the arrival of reinforcements, the Ukrainian army launched a series of attacks, not only reversing some of the lost positions 2 days ago, but also re-entering in the southern part of Klishchiivka. I think that happened about 5 days ago, and they're just kind of slowly adapting their mapping to what had already happened. Here in this area, Syriac Maps claimed that the Russians had a large territorial gain northwest of Khodymyvka 2 days ago, but no one else reported that. And now I don't know if this is kind of walking back what they claimed. It really wasn't the fact that the Russians had taken that massive area of land, and actually, they were just a little bit overconfident there. That would be my opinion of Bakhmut. I don't know. Yeah, there is some Bakhmut mapping from Poulet-Bavlon that kind of shows what I was talking about in the two areas to the north of Bakhmut where the Russians have had a little bit of success. Okay, so we're going to move out of Bakhmut. And not really heard anything about Avdiivka. Not that it'll be quiet. I'm sure there'll be lots of fighting, but somewhat quieter in terms of what's being reported as well. In the southern Donetsk front and Mariinka too, we'll bypass them and come to the Velika Novosilka sector, which is in the Berdyansk direction, as is often said. Some say in the Mariupol direction. That's more from sort of Vuhledar area. So this is the Berdyansk direction from Velika Novosilka down the river and into Uruzhaini. So Staromilsk was taken. There's a lot of talk about Uruzhaini. Let's go through some of the claims. If here we'll start with Berdyansk direction situation in the village of Uruzhaini. The armed forces took the northern part. Sorry, Ukrainian armed forces took the northern part of the village. Fighting is going on in the centre, and the presence of the armed forces of the Ukraine in the southwestern part of the village was also recorded there. Judging by the footage, the armed forces successfully cleared the buildings of the insurgents. So this is all positive news, saying that towards the north and towards the southwest, the Ukrainians have been pushing, which is to say they are pushing from the north and they're pushing from the southwest here in this direction across the river. And then earlier this evening, so that's yesterday, Russian sources were reporting that the Russians withdrew from parts of Uruzhaini in prepared defensive positions, and are now reporting heavy fighting, and we are holding our positions. The Rebar Telegram channel, the pro-Russian source, saying the gnawing of the armed forces of Ukraine into the settlement of Uruzhaini and the withdrawal of our troops to reserve positions. So that's what their kind of language is. And some Ukrainian analysts believe that Ukrainians have entrenched themselves into the northern part of the town, and that more than half of it is a grey zone contested. Ukrainian General Staff has said very little. And then throughout the day today, it's been a case of more and more of the settlement being bitten off by the Ukrainians, and they're forcing the Russians further to the south. And indeed, some of the latest. Well, the latest is that it may well be. It may well have been liberated. So here is one source. This is a Russian source. Again, uh, always good to take note of what the Russians are saying about their own movement. So Russian sources claim that Ukraine has liberated the village of Uruzhany, Donetsk Oblast. We are waiting for confirmation from the Ukrainians. And the translation of the Russian post, Google Translate, harvest being the translation of Uruzhany, nevertheless repeated. So Uruzhany nevertheless repeated Staromilske. This was to be expected. The art of the crest works without interruption. Wings fly in the sky. Quite know what all this means, other than possibly aviation support. I hope these two NP paratroopers will not storm. Only ruins remain of the villages. We must work. We need counter battery combat. So this is not the first. It's not the last time we're hearing that the Russian counter battery is not effective and they need more of it. And everything will be fine. The decision to surrender the village was the right one. Better than hiding in the ruins and not sticking out and then losing the guys. I hope heavy ones will roll up to zero. So I guess that means I hope we get heavy equipment coming in, and it continues, and aviation will also work actively. Good luck, brothers. So that is to say that it could be that the Ukrainians have liberated the village of Uruzhany finally, and the Russians have been pushed out from the village to the south. The Ukrainians have been attacking from all three directions: the north, kind of the northeast, and from the west as well. And that's just meant it's been untenable for the Russians to remain there. This is other Russian source saying the enemy has matured to use our Mariupol tactics. So they're using tactics in Uruzhany that the Russians were using in Mariupol. So he sends a small group until he faces fire contact, pulls back, and strikes with artillery at the identified position. After that, he crawls into the cleared basement. This is possible only with the unpunished work of artillery. We return to the question of counter-battery fire. If we do not change the situation, we can lose Uruzhany. So, translated, that means that the Ukrainians sort of charge in to contact and then find out where the Russians are, then pull back and then hit the Russians with artillery. But instead of flattening the entire village like the Russians would have done at Mariupol, it would be far more precision guided munitions being used and precision attacks. And meanwhile, they'll be in basements waiting it out. And the Russians, again, ruining that they don't have counter battery fire to hit back. And so this is what the Ukrainians are doing, as according to the Russians. So it looks like Uruzhany might well have been liberated by the Ukrainians. We shall see. And that is a good read of that situation. If that is happening, they're also attacking to the north of Pryutny as well. It's important if Uruzhany falls or is liberated by the Ukrainians, then that's really important because Kremenchuk will be possibly next. If they can get down in here, then that cuts off Novodonetsk, and the Russians will be forced to pull out of there. We know that Novomyolsk is under a lot of pressure, so this could have some kind of um, effect, sort of domino effect on the Ukrainians, on the Russian defense in the whole area. Right, okay, so as we come to the west, we'll pull out a little bit and come to the west to the Robotna area. We have a similar sort of situation with what's taking place in Robotna there, by point of fact that it appears to be surrounded by on three sides, and the Ukrainians are giving the Russians a hard time. So let's look at some of the sources concerning Robotna. Here earlier today, I reported this one. How Ukraine has entered Robotna and has taken 1.7 square kilometers, added that to the liberated status. That's more to the north. So we saw this area here. The Ukrainians yesterday were by the signpost coming into Robotna and also in the cemetery area. So that's just geolocated evidence of the Ukrainians fighting in the north of Robotna. We have Global War Monitor later in the day saying geolocated footage shows a further Ukrainian advance north of Robotna. 3 square kilometers was added to the liberated status. That is much more over in this area. However, Syriac Maps has some Russian gains just southwest of Novopokrovka, and that could be a bit of a problem for the Ukrainians in that area. and then Andrew Perpetua has some gains to the east, and Syriac Maps has gains for the Ukrainians to the north. So there's some good news in the Robotina area. Here's another source saying Ukrainians, this is P-Star 11, saying Ukrainians control the northern half of the settlement and southeast from it. It is reported they are not far from Novopokrovka, which is further down to the south here. So they could be really advancing further than people might have thought, but it's difficult. There are so many claims coming out from Robotna from both sides, and it's been difficult for the Ukrainians. They've certainly uh, breached this first line of defense northeast of Robotna, and have been working their way down that trench line towards Verbove. But if they can get past that and then down to Novopokrivka, it'll be interesting to see how well manned the second line of defense is for the Russians here. But maybe that's getting ahead of myself. Yep. So that's a situation around Robotna. Syriac Maps did admit that the Ukrainians were in the north, but then they were supposedly repelled by the Russians. That was yesterday. That's a typical thing that Syriac would say. It seems like they certainly have been in the north. Whether they have been repelled, I don't know. I guess next 24 hours we'll find out. Then Syriac Maps also admitted that Ukrainians had some success further to the east, which kind of fits in with what Andrew Perpetua was sort of saying, although there's still a big difference between the two. This is a slightly later. I don't know if this is updated. I mean, massive thanks to JR who's updated my maps. He's a total legend. But yeah, this area here. So Syriac Map says, following the recent geolocations, it's possible to update the front line, showing that the Russian army and the Ukrainian army achieved partial success in the grey areas of Novopokrovka, yeah, and Robotna axis respectively. So yeah, 6 of one, half a dozen the other. But I think things are looking much better for the Ukrainians in the Robotna sector, and that's partly apparently, or largely apparently, due to the different unit active on to the west of Robotna that have been incrementally biting off chunks, losing far less than those fighting to the east. A lot of equipment was lost, as we've seen a number of times over the past few months in this whole area. The Malatokmachka area, in fact, all the way down here, the Ukrainians have lost a lot of troops, a lot of equipment. On the western side, it's fared slightly better, or a lot better, arguably. And it's these guys that are pressuring the Russians in Robotna, that are getting the success in taking parts of the town. So that's good news for the Ukrainians there. Not a lot of news coming out of Kamyanska and Piatychaki, Sherebianki there, where there's positional fighting continuing. So we come to Kherson Oblast and to the Dnipro River Delta, where there's a lot of news coming out of particularly the Kozachi-Lahiri area just here. We have some changes of mapping to the darker blue represents the changes in mapping to Syriac maps that are basically accepting that these islands in the river delta they had originally under Russian control. It was like basically the right bank was Ukrainian and everything on the left bank was Russian, but actually these islands and this delta is far more contested, and I think they're kind of pretty much admitting that now. Just by the way, I was talking to someone on a thread about left bank, right bank. Here is why left bank and right bank are much better ways of describing positions concerning a riverbank. So you talk about left and right bank in the direction that the river flows. So this river is kind of flowing northeast to southwest. Um, it's confusing for this river because the left bank is actually on the right of the screen. This is the left bank as the river flows. Imagine you're standing looking in the direction it flows. This is the left bank. This is the right bank. Why that is good and why it's better than cardinal points of a compass. I was talking about this with someone else the other day. This is a perfect example. So we're going to go back to Velika Novosilka and we're going to look at the river as it comes down into Velika Novosilka, and we're going to look at the Mokry Yeli River. Right here, left bank and right bank is consistent. So the left bank is this side, always this side, and that's the side, one side of the riverbank, and the right bank is the other side. you can't use the north bank around here. So you said the north bank of the river by Staromiorsky. Well, that's north, which is the right bank there, but that's north and it's the left bank because it meanders and it goes in all directions here. So the most sensible way to look at the river is in terms of left and right bank. The north, south, east, and west will get you absolutely confused if you were to use those directions in with a river that meanders all over the shop like that one does there. Anyway, I just thought I'd explain that for you know as a digression. Right, let's move back to what's going on in Kherson. So some adjustment to the mapping around Holopristan. I've not heard much about the supposed Ukrainian bridgehead around Holopristan. I don't know if that's definitely the case. Really not heard a lot about activity around the Antonivsky Bridge area either. It all seems to be about what's going on around Kazachi Lahiri. We'll go to look at some of the sources now. We'll start here, which is Rybar. Russian sources claiming that Ukraine has crossed the Konka River in Kherson Oblast for the very first time. I mean, it's not for the first time, but they're admitting it for the first time. So the Konka River is this one that comes up here, particularly. That is coming towards Oleshki, and this is to accept that the Ukrainians are on this side and they are pressuring. Oleshki just recently, before recording this, over the last few hours, has been hit, I think, this afternoon by a lot of artillery. So it's being hit heavily by the Ukrainians. The Ukrainians are also advancing towards Oleshki and are attacking it from the west. They are to the south of the Konka River. And that is the first time that people like Rebar have admitted that, although Andrew Perpetua had them having control over this for a good sort of week plus, and indeed a control right along there now. But yeah, that's the difference between the sources, I guess. So that is significant. We have here Suryat maps admitting that the Ukrainians have got purchase to the north of Kozachi Lahiri and are controlling all of this stuff in the river delta, and even have there's even grey zone to the west of Kozachi Lahiri, and actually that's picked up by a lot of the mappers as well. So Suryat map seems to be correct. Romanov, a pro-Russian blogger, claims that the western part of Kozachi Lahiri is under Ukrainian control. So this is the western part there. And Andrew Perpetua says, could be under control. Romanov has said that. But it's quite interesting about it. So Romanov is this ultra-nationalist pro-Russian military blogger, and he said a number of things about Kozachi Lahiri, and I think he's got himself in a bit of trouble. So Romanov, western part of Kozachi Lahiri is under the enemy. There is a constant shelling of the settlement from the armed forces of Ukraine. Now he's rather similar to Evil Gherkin in terms of being a bit of a realist, and as a result, he appears to have possibly been arrested, or at least they are onto him. So all is not well in Occupy Kherson. Romanov Light, who earlier reported on Ukrainian successes on the left bank near Kozachi Lahiri, now says local command has ordered he be detained and handed over to the FSB. He shares a screenshot of a message which he claims has been verified. So it could be, Evil Gherkin Mark II. It's been tough around there. Thomas Steiner says it's going to get much, much worse for the Russians soon. Ukrainians are rapidly reinforcing their beachhead in the Dnieper's left bank, but OPSEC means that no videos, no brigade names, etc. for now. This is referring to the sources saying Russia's control of the left bank of Dnieper and Kherson is crumbling fast as the Ukrainian special forces teams operate deep in the rear. Here, in a video released by Sobchak, troops of the Battalion 1822, raised in Moscow, so there's a Russian source giving claims about what's happened to their battalion, say they've lost 40% of their men in 2 weeks. So this fighting has been ongoing. It's not just the last few days. It has been going on for weeks. It's just a lot of operational security, and they've lost 40% of their troops. That is a massive. This is the grey zone. There's been a lot of shelling in the area there. This Getty says that Cossack camps is what Kozachi Lahiri means. The armed forces of Ukraine advance on the left bank of the Dnieper, northeast of the village of Podsteponyoye, and west of the village of Kozachi camp to Kazachi Lahiri. So there could be advances in several directions, which is pretty important. Thomas Tyner says it wasn't a raid either. The British SAS and SBS, Special Air Service, Special Boat Services, so sort of land or air and naval kind of special forces, trained special Ukrainian special forces, and to secure the landing grounds. You know that they are trained by those and with the ability to secure landing grounds. Lots of light infantry have been ferried across the Dnipro. Ukrainian forces are steadily expanding the beachhead. Russia has zero armored and zero mechanized forces in the area. It's a light infantry fight. The only Russian reinforcements are propaganda bloggers who don't dare come close to Kazachi Lahiri. Russian artillery, except for mortars, is barely active. And to quote a Ukrainian officer fighting there, we're not leaving. So it is. This is a really significant development that could give the Ukrainians a real springboard to either go and hassle Melitopol and join up with the forces coming down from the Zaporizhia front line, or to attack through to Armyansk. They're very close to interdicting this highway here, which is pretty important for logistics right along the Dnipro River. And that's where they're at the moment. So that would be significant if they can get on the main roads and get troop movements along the roads. Then they might be able to bypass some of the heavy entrenchments that exist in the Kherson Oblast. But the question is always, well, do the Russians have troops to man those defenses? So I think Armyansk is going to be objective number one. Really, Henichesk and Chonhar bridges have been hit. So we know there's a bottleneck of logistics in the Armyansk area that is waiting to be hit by storm shadows somewhere. I'm sure around that area, but we could see that it might be a bit of a juicy target for the actual troops. Obviously, it's a long way to go and there's a lot of fighting to be done, but you can see that getting across the Dnipro, they'll be probing in a whole number of places here. It's a kind of game of whack-a-mole, as I've said before, where the Russians, in order to try and defend down here, they have to pull troops from up in the Zaporizhia front line. But we already know that they've drafted their elite troops from the Kherson region to there to fill the trenches. So there are no reserves to draw from. So what do the Ukrainians do? What do the Russians do here in trying to stop the Ukrainians getting across the river in all these different places? They need a significant number of defensive troops that they just don't have. So this could be a really interesting couple of weeks, I think, in terms of what's going along uh, both in Velika Novosilka and the Malatok Machka sectors, but also up and down the Dnipro River. Bearing in mind, things are still happening in Bakhmut, generally in favor of the Ukrainians, but the northeast is presenting itself to be a bit of a thorn, possibly in the side of the Ukrainians, and the Russians are having small successes in a number of places. So, yeah, lots going on, but let's keep an eye on what's going on in Kherson. Really important area. Anyway, that's enough from me. I really need to go and have a drink now. Um, Thank you. Take care. Appreciate all the support. And I'll speak to you tomorrow. Toodle pips.